Passiamo.
Let us now move on to a session which focuses on an issue which is close to the heart of our discussions, the state of negotiations before the COP25 meeting, which will be held in Glasgow. The first keynote speakers in this session is the Italian Minister for Ecological Transition, Roberto CINGOLANI, and I would like to call on him to take the floor. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sorry? Okay, thank you, Mr. President. I will use this about 10 minutes to tell you what's going on through the pipeline that started with the G20 meeting in Naples at the end of July, through the recent, in the last week, the recent Youth for Climate event that was joined to the Pre-Cop event, also in Milan, and just before yesterday in Luxembourg, the ministerial meeting of the European environmental transition ministers of the European Union. There was quite an evolution because in Naples, the main message at a given point was that all countries in the G20 shared the point that we should have agreed unanimously to the Paris Agreement target, and including China, including India. So the point was we have to be below 2 degrees by the second part of the century. However, a few weeks ago we got the IPCC report that clearly stated that there was actually a delay in our agenda, and as you know, the temperature was supposed to increase by 2.73 degrees. So this has generated a sort of urgency. The main wording during last week in Milan at the Pre-COP and Youth for Climate events was ambition plus acceleration. That has emerged today in the various interventions that you gave. So let's see which are the 5 points that we are forwarding to the COP26 as a result of the work done in the Pre-COP. The first one, that definitely we have to keep the 1.5 degrees concept alive. That is an acceleration, as you heard before. It was not anonymously accepted a few months ago, and now even the biggest countries having, of course, a much bigger problem in changing their strategy, they have admitted that we have to be well below 2 degrees. So there's the hope that we can share the ambitious target of 1.5 degrees at the COP26. Just want to give you the numbers that was mentioned before during the interventions of the various parliamentarians. You are obviously aware of the fact that the G20 organization represents approximately 4.8 billion people around the world, producing 80% of the greenhouse gas. But the COP26 actually embodies more than 190 countries, so it embodies another 3 billion people that hardly produce 20% of greenhouse gas. 1 billion of that, approximately 1 billion, having no access to electricity, and most of them having no clean fuel for cooking. That means that even the definition of ecological transition changed, depending on whether you're in Finland, in Italy, or wherever in the United States, or in other most vulnerable countries. So this is something that has become very clear and has become commonly accepted. We can't separate the strategy for the climate change fight by the strategy for the reduction of the global inequality. If we don't treat the two things together, we will fail anyway. The second expectation for the COP26 has to do with carbon pricing. So how we balance the market, because there are countries producing duties by using technology and manufacturing that is carbon intensive. How do we phase out unabated coal power sources, and in general, how do we phase out coal-based manufacturing? We all agree that this has to be done. Countries are much faster, targeting at 2025. Other countries are targeting much longer, 2030, 2035. And of course, if a large country reaches the peak 5 years after the others, we might have a global imbalancement at a given point that essentially will not allow everybody to match the Paris Agreement target, the 55% decarbonization. Another issue for the COP26 is subsidizing coal technologies. This has to be reduced, but of course, countries have different strategies. There's no consensus, global consensus. We all know that we have to do it, but the timing is again different, as well as how do we accomplish the transition by ensuring the needed technological neutrality. Energy production in different countries, the strategy of energy production in different countries is different. And of course, technology neutrality is something that we have to accomplish, but we don't have a unified recipe. Those are points that will be discussed at the COP26. The third pillar of the discussion has to do with adaptation, loss, and damage. And particularly, adaptation is something we've been discussing a lot, primarily because we have to operationalize, so making it operative, the Santiago network for loss and damage. There are countries in which catastrophic events, extreme events, can lead to dramatic change, to enormous problems, and there the intervention has to be instantaneous, which is not the case in the richer countries, for instance. So the Santiago network has to be made effective, quick, operational. The fourth pillar of the discussion has to do with rules, governance, accounting capability, and more in general, Article 6. So the nationally determined contribution to the transition has to be based on a very transparent metric. We can't give numbers that are not based on a unified and well-established metric with the right degree of transparency. Otherwise, we will fail in having a global assessment of what's going on over the next year. Europe is, for instance, targeting the European Transparency Framework, but of course, this is not only Europe. Europe produces only 9% of the greenhouse gas. So this has to be global, also to protect weaker countries. We need a common reporting table for the greenhouse gas. This should be the final result. This is something we have to address and decide precisely at the COP26. Once again, there was quite a general consensus around those concepts during our discussion. I can guarantee at the G20 in Naples, at the Pre-Cop in Milan, at the Youth for Climate in Milan, and before yesterday at the ministerial meeting of Europe, there was general consensus. The point is, how do we make those things real? So it's a matter of algorithms, of technicalities, but I have the feeling that everybody agrees, and that's very important. Finally, and this is really least but not last, finance. In Paris 2015, we promised, the rich countries have promised, to raise 100 billion per year to support vulnerable countries and to reduce inequalities. So far, we hardly reached the 60 billion. And of course, the COVID period didn't help. Even the best economies had quite a recoil. So this year, and this is exactly what happened 2 days ago in Luxembourg, the European ministers all agreed about the fact that we do have to accomplish the 100 billion. United States, everybody agrees, okay? There's no point of discussion. But we all know that 100 billion is not enough. Because the 3 billion people we're talking, they're possibly spread over hundreds of countries or so, and of course 100 billion is nothing. So there is a clear awareness about the fact that those 100 billion, they act like a spark. They should leverage at least 1 trillion. So the new wording that came out in the last weeks is that we have to make a trillion range effort to reduce inequality. Trillion is, as you know, 1,000 billions. So the 100 public billions should rise at least 1,000 private billions. And this is a new concept of public-private partnership through investment banks, private investors, philanthropy, and the public has the responsibility to drain those money, to push this fundraising, and to reduce inequalities as soon as possible. So the last point is that we need to rethink global financial architectures. This is really necessary now to help better, to help more effectively, and to make all our promises real. That means, again, public-private partnership, treating properly indebted countries, so how do we manage with the big debts of some countries, and finally, fiscal frame, that especially in the field of climate actions, it's very important. It has to be possibly redesigned. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the outcome of the last few months that were very effective. I had the honor to be the president of the G20 Environment and Energy in Naples. I did see quite an advancement, but after the IPCC report, I saw a further ambition and a further acceleration to be established at the Pre-Cop in Milan 1 week ago, and before yesterday in Luxembourg. At least the European position was very clear. We should make all those things real, and this will need a lot of work, but I think the preconditions are very promising for the Pre-Cop, and this is where we are. Thank you for your attention.
Invito ora all'intervento.
I'd like to call on the Special Counselor, Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General for Climate Action and Under Secretary for the Sport Team on Climate Action, Mr. Winhart, and this will be a remote contribution.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning from New York, and good evening to you in Italy. It's always a pleasure to see Minister CINGOLANI. I thank him for his outstanding leadership as host of the presidency of the G20, as well as the skillful job that he did at the Pre-Cop in guiding the negotiations. Now, we're just over 3 weeks away from COP26, and this is the most important climate conference since Paris. It really must be a decisive conference for humanity and for the planet. And the science tells us, as the distinguished minister just said, that we have an ever-narrowing window of opportunity to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And COP26 must be that moment when the world accelerates progress at scale and pace to close the gaps that we have on mitigation, finance, and on adaptation. But of course, COP26 is not happening in isolation. It is happening in the context of a global pandemic. It is happening in the context of an uneven global recovery. It is happening in the context of vaccine inequity. It is happening in the context of looming fiscal crisis, rising debt levels in many parts of the developing world. And unfortunately, these issues have resulted in a breakdown in trust between the developed and the developing world. And it was good to see last week at the pre-COP session that I attended, how the conversations were frank, how they were open, and how the distinguished minister was able to help bridge some of this trust deficit that is missing between the developed and the developing world. We're also seeing devastating and unprecedented climate impacts. And we're seeing these impacts on every continent, in every region, and in every country. Just last year alone, 30 million persons were displaced from climate-related disasters. And this is 3 times more than the persons which were displaced or who were displaced from war and violence. Now, science is also telling us that these impacts will increase in frequency and severity, and they will be felt worst in nations and in communities and by people in vulnerable and in fragile situations. So the good news is that we know what needs to be done. the world has the tools, both financial and technological, to do the job, and that we have a framework, a multilateral framework to mobilize action, namely the Paris Agreement. So the Secretary General has identified three priorities as we head towards COP26, which will help us to provide the world with a credible narrative that we are on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. First is keeping 1.5 alive. The 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement must be met. The reality is that we're way off target, as the minister indicated. The current national commitments, or NDCs, nationally determined contributions, that have been presented place the world on a pathway of 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. This is unacceptable. We need all G20 nations, as the minister indicated, G20 nations account for 80% of global emissions. We need all G20 nations ahead of Glasgow to submit new and more ambitious NDCs. Some have resubmitted their Paris NDCs, their 2015 national climate plans, which are grossly insufficient. So we need your help to reach out to as many of these countries as possible to get them to submit as more ambitious nationally determined contributions. Glasgow must also signal the end of coal. During the high-level week of the General Assembly, the president of China indicated that China will end international finance of coal. This places China in the company of Japan and Korea, who announced earlier this year that they will end international coal financing to the developing world. This is an extremely valuable and useful step, but we need more commitment, and we need firmer commitments from countries on ambitious phase-out dates for their domestic coal consumption. This is one of the key deliverables that must be delivered at Glasgow. At Glasgow, we also need a roadmap on how this mitigation gap between the national commitments that countries have put on the table, as well as the gap between the NDCs and the 1.5-degree goal, how that gap will be closed in a very credible way. The Paris Agreement states in its Article 4 that countries don't need to submit an NDC or nationally determined contribution every 5 years, but can submit a national climate plan or an NDC at any time. A number of countries, for example, over the course of the last 2 days, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates have made new net zero by mid-century commitments. Countries should be encouraged to submit NDCs after Glasgow if they don't have enough time to finalize a new and more ambitious NDCs. So we're hoping that we can have a credible package that shows the world that the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement remains within reach. And we need your help and support in order to achieve this. The second priority of the Secretary General is on finance. The $100 billion commitment that was made since 2019, it's also a symbol of trust in the multilateral climate process. And it's a mere down payment on the trillions, as the minister so eloquently said, that will be needed to support adaptation and resilience in the developing world. According to the OECD, we are about $20 billion short of this $100 billion commitment. and no effort should be spared in terms of encouraging countries, including Italy. We will be pushing you as well to increase your public climate finance commitment so that, again, we can tell a credible story that the gap between under 100 billion is closing and that it will be delivered to the developing world. And finally, on adaptation and resilience, it is unfortunately, and this is the third priority of the Secretary General, we have to be very honest with ourselves. Adaptation remains the neglected half of the climate equation. After close to 3 decades of multilateral negotiations on climate, support for adaptation and resilience stands at a mere 25% of total climate finance support. In the Paris Agreement, a promise was made to the developing world that support for mitigation and adaptation would be balanced given the urgency of the climate crisis and the urgency of climate impacts, especially in the vulnerable countries, like the least developed countries and small island developing states. At the UN, we estimate that the adaptation costs facing the developing world currently stand at about $70 billion a year, and that this would quadruple to about $300 billion a year by 2030. So I cannot stress how urgent it is to significantly scale up adaptation finance to vulnerable developing countries. And this is why the Secretary General has been calling on donors and the MDBs to allocate at least 50% of their public climate finance support towards adaptation and resilience needs in the developing world. Failure to deliver on adaptation and resilience means loss of lives and livelihoods in the developing world. It means growing instability in countries in already fragile situations. So the world has a moral obligation for prioritizing adaptation support to the most vulnerable countries. Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands have pledged to provide at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience. And we hope that other countries, including Italy and the EU, will also send this really positive signal to the developing world. We also need Italy and the European Union to use their voice on the boards of the multilateral development banks to press these institutions to be more ambitious on climate change. It is concerning that after 10 years, in excess of a decade of having climate targets, the MDBs still mobilize less than $1 of private finance for every dollar of MDB finance. Less than $1 of private finance. They need to do a much better job in mobilizing private finance because we need private finance at scale. So we hope that Italy will use its voice as a shareholder on the MDBs to press for this. So finally, we believe, and the Secretary General believes, that success remains within reach. We will need Italy and the European Union, who've traditionally played important bridge building roles between developed and developing countries, to undertake this as we head towards Glasgow. It means not only engaging with the G20 nations, but also with the small island developing states, countries in Africa, the least developed countries, countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region. As the minister indicated, this is a multilateral process with over 190 countries who have many different interests. So we look forward to success in Glasgow. We also look to success at the upcoming G20 Leaders Summit that the Secretary General will be participating in. And we continue to look forward to the outstanding leadership of Italy as we use the COP26 in Glasgow as this important moment where the world accelerates progress to close the gaps on mitigation, on finance, and on adaptation. I thank you so much, Mr. President.
Grazie.
Many thanks. We now move to our discussion. I'd like to remind you that each speaker has 2 minutes available in the discussion. We have Angelo Farrugia, Speaker of the House of Representatives of Malta first.
Grazie, Presidente. Climate change is the most enduring threat to our futures. And I'm delighted to hear Minister Roberto CINGOLANI and also the Speaker of Special Advisor of the United Nations. Of course, Malta, as a small island state, has various legally binding targets to meet by 2020 and 2030 as a new member state and party to the multilateral legal instruments combating climate change like the Paris Agreement. During the strenuous 2020 year, Malta has updated the Climate Change Act by limiting anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gas, sinks and of course reservoirs. This year, Malta has embarked on an ambitious 30-year journey towards total decarbonization, which involves a low-carbon development strategy and a plan to have cleaner vehicles on our roads. I recall the important CPA, that is the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Small Branches Climate Change Workshop, which I conducted in Nairobi, Kenya, with collaboration with UNEP, where parliamentarians, the small jurisdictions, discussed the shared challenges associated with climate change. And we came out with the Toolkit for Parliamentarians. The Toolkit was designed in collaboration with and for use by national governments and also international organizations. We have a critical role to identify the most cost-effective measures to reduce emissions across the sectors involving energy, buildings, transport, industry, waste, agriculture and water. This multifaceted approach, championed by small states, provides, Mr. Chairman, a fresh and a renewed method of combating climate change tailored to small states. Malta, a small state in the Mediterranean, certainly is leading by example. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you. Next on my list is Bernard Dilla, Vice President of the National Assembly of the Central African Republic. You have the floor.
È presente Bernard Dilla?
Is Bernard Dilla with us? Let us then move on. On my list, I have Alice Mary Higgins, member of the Senate of Ireland.
Prego. Mi scusi? Prego.
Yes, please go ahead.
Microfono, per favore.
The microphone, please.
No more evasions or delays. We know we must deliver in COP26. Finalization of the Paris rulebook with transparency, NDCs that reflect common but differentiated responsibilities, early action on methane to stay within 1.5 degrees, and action to end the abuse of emissions trading and offsets to skew accountancy. On funding, delivering the 100 billion promised and owed under both Paris and the SDGs, as well as adaptation funding and payment for loss and damage. Coherence, so the policy space needed by countries to act on climate is not undermined by old debts and old trade rules. ISDS compensation cannot be allowed to delay the exit from fossil fuels. And profits from intellectual property cannot be allowed to delay the rollout of urgent global solutions and technology transfer. including public-public partnerships. We cannot afford business as usual or a greenwash. The new paths we need require that economics fits inside our environmental and planetary boundaries, including the new digital industries, which must also fit within these boundaries in their energy usage. Human rights and gender equality must be core in COP26, including the new right to a healthy environment agreed just today at the UN Human Rights Council. Crucially, the Action for Climate Justice programme under Article 6 must be strengthened, listening to and led by Indigenous peoples and youth who understand the links between climate and biodiversity, between solidarity and survival. As public representatives of the peoples across this beautiful, fragile planet, the only one with life, we have a responsibility now to be brave and to act. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Next on my list, Ankurao Kalla, First Vice President of the National Assembly of Niger.
Ankurao Kalla.
Ankurao Kalla. Well, let us move on then. Press the yellow button. There we go.
Thank you very much, President. Our delegation is very happy to take part in this debate, and we would like to speak about two very important issues in this debate. In regards to the fight against climate change. Firstly, the Great Green Wall Initiative in Africa. This project includes all of the Sahelian countries. This is very important because it implements attempts to reduce desert coverage and restore the environment, and it provides jobs to thousands of young people. This will boost economies after 2 years of recession due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen many natural disasters, not only in the Sahel, but also throughout Africa. And we need to really step up our efforts here to reduce the occurrence of such natural phenomena. As for us, we are going to ensure that we, members of Parliament, ensure that we have laws which also raise awareness in the general public in relation to the threat of climate change. Thank you very much, President.
Grazie.
Thank you. Next on my list is Raúl Bolaños Cachoque, Chair of the Committee of Environment of the Senate of Mexico. The speaker says he hopes he's pronouncing your words properly.
Will deliver my message in my national language. Buenas tardes a todos.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Mexican delegation, I would like to express our grave concerns in relation to the current state of the COP26 negotiations. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a challenge for all countries, but it must be said that poorer countries have had great difficulties when it comes to having access to vaccines and guaranteeing food security. We need to ensure that we make sure that we don't see these dangerous increases in temperature. I encourage everyone to take into account the fact that climate change exacerbates the inequalities that exist in our societies, and we have countries which are very vulnerable to climate change. We are committed to reducing emissions and fighting against climate change, but we need to call on the international community to invest more. Mexico is committed to enacting public policies in line with international obligations in relation to climate change. We will continue to call upon developed countries to fulfill their commitments. We owe it to our young people and to future generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next on my list is Marcos Pereira, member of the Chamber of Deputies of Brazil.
Mr. President.
Prego la mascherina.
Sim, sorry. I will speak in Portuguese. Ladies and gentlemen, a cooperação interamericana, interparlamentar, é indispensável para o êxito de ações e iniciativas em face de desafios que são comuns ao conjunto da comunidade internacional.
We need to fight against climate change and address the challenges accepted. This issue is very important for our Chamber of Deputies in Brazil. We encourage all efforts to fight against climate change. The commitments adopted by Brazil are very important in this area, especially when it comes, of course, to the Paris Agreement and the UN Convention on Climate Change. It's very important to ensure that we have these nationally determined contributions and that we fulfill these commitments. We have done that in Brazil. We think it's very important to conserve biodiversity in Brazil. Our chamber approved the distribution of clean energy, and we also have adopted measures to provide incentives for a carbon market and put in place a carbon market in our country. We have also examined and reviewed the Kigali Protocol for the reduction of the impact of climate change. We are also trying to reduce certain practices in Brazil which are negative for the environment and climate, and we're also trying to reduce the occurrence of forest fires. So we have an attitude of oversight, which is very open to cooperation. We hope that Brazil will be in a position to make very significant progress hand in hand with the international community to ensure that we can resolve this urgent crisis caused by climate change. Thank you very much.
Intervenire Nauren Farouk Ibrahim, membro dell'Assemblea Nazionale del Pakistan. Prego.
Thank you.
Forget.
Change. But still, their share in carbon and greenhouse emissions is very low. All the reasons why developed countries should support developing countries. Funds would be required to hire consultants to prepare such detailed documents. Pakistan strongly supports the goal of reaching net zero by 2050. Another risk to climate ambition is transitional emissions, which so far have not been accounted for in international negotiations, particularly those of the aviation and shipping industries, as well as crop burning. Climate change also poses a significant threat to global food security. Any reduction in biodiversity combined with changing weather patterns reduces crop yields and results in food shortage. We call for a global commitment to its principles of assisting the transformation of latest scientific farming methods to Pakistan as a key to climate actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is Kharoula Kafantari, member of the Hellenic Parliament.
Thank you.
La mascherina, per favore.
Your face mask, please.
Posso chiedere di mettere la mascherina e cambiare?
Can I ask you to put on a your face mask and to change your microphone, to move to another microphone? There's some interference in that microphone.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. The last issue of IPCC report describes accurately the present situation of global climate change. It is stressed out that all necessary means must be taken urgently to limit the global warming. On the other hand, FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, report the situation on the food system. 40% of the world population have not the means to afford healthy and nutritious food, a situation worsened by the impacts of climate change. The last report issued with co-working of United Nations states that biodiversity is deteriorating worldwide, and this decline is projected to worsen. All these reports confirm that the world is under a triple threat: climate change, food insecurity, loss of biodiversity. The answer to all this is simple: the transition to new economies with radical change of development models, including change of consumer habits, sustainable energy production and agricultural methods, environmental protections and restoring ecosystems. To achieve our climate goals, governments, business, civil society need to work together to manage the increasing impacts of climate change on our lives. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Next on my list, Elisabeth Schmuck, Chair of the Committee for Sustainable Development of the National Assembly of Hungary.
Thank you very much. Dear Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the excellent presentations enlightening the main points of climate emergency, the necessity of urgent global and national commitments, all in light of climate science. According to the sixth assessment report of IPCC addressing the most up-to-date physical understanding of the climate system and climate change, there is a serious lessons to be learned. No action is not an option. Human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. As for me, it is not a question that we should secure global net zero greenhouse gas emission by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. The only question is how to do it. Until now, we have had a lot of discussions, have made papers about the necessity of strengthening national and sectoral contributions, targets and tools. But we have to recognize that it is not enough. It is already obvious that without strict commitments of individual countries and without ambitious indices, we will not be able to restrain climate change. Last year, the Hungarian parliament accepted the climate law and we have climate strategy as well. But I have to say that we are far away from those steps that are introduced in IPCC reports. Fortunately, due to the public awareness-raising campaigns, more and more people lift up their voice for efficiency measures, for actions, mitigating emission and helping adoption. I am sure that we have to fulfill their expectations. The Hungarian IPU group fully supports the draft outcome document of the parliamentary meeting. Thank you very much for the attention.
Grazie.
Thank you. Next on my list is Konstantin Kosachev, Deputy Speaker of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation.
Dear colleagues, Russia has successfully fulfilled its obligations under the Kyoto Protocol and adopted the Paris Agreement. Last November, we set national targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. By 2030, their level should be no more than 70% of the 1990 level. 2, our country considers the Paris Agreement to be a reliable international legal framework for a long-term climate settlement. We therefore welcome the agreement on most of the rules for implementing the Paris Agreement. As a result, the agreement has become a full-fledged working document. 3, unfortunately, during the 25th session of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Madrid, participants did not agree on common approaches to the implementation of market and non-market mechanism of the Paris Agreement. We look forward for completing this work during the 26th Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. 4, in general, we positively assess the results of the 52nd session of the subsidiary bodies of the UN Framework Convention, held online in June this year. This event provides a good basis for bringing the positions of the participating states closer together. 5, Russia attaches great importance to the package of solutions for the financial and technological sector. Our country does not have legal obligations under the UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement to provide financial assistance to developing countries, but we provide donor assistance on a voluntary basis. And finally, we hope that before the Glasgow conference, we will be able to bring the positions of the parties on the climate agenda closer together. Thank you. Perfect timing.
E la ringrazio.
Anna, thank you for that. Next on my list, Katia Regina de Vreu for us. Is the implementation of the NDCs recently announced. Brazil has comparative advantages, has the goal of reducing its emissions by 38%, and reduce the illegal cutting of forests. We have a country which can keep to its commitments. The government and all Brazilian states have committed to take part in the Glasgow COP conference. We have 46% of all energy generation, 85% of all electricity in the country, which pursued from renewable sources, and this keeps us from the burden of only having to convert greenhouses. We have to reduce carbon use. We have already introduced sustainable agriculture, and the ban on forest removal has already saved many hectares in recent years, which is equivalent to 13 times the surface area of Italy. A large part of our biome is conserved in the Amazon, where we have the world but we do not accept illegal attacks against the Amazon basin, which we can preserve Amazon before the work.
Grazie.
Thank you. On my list, I have John Mcgowan, member of the Irish Senate.
Thank you, Chairperson. Just on behalf of the Irish delegation, I'd just like to say it's a real pleasure to be here as a younger member of Parliament, to see so many other parliamentarians here that are so committed to climate action, and the determination in this room today is really quite inspiring. And these negotiations are so important for our future. It's our last chance, indeed our very last chance to get it correct. It should be framed through opportunity, it should be framed through positivity, and it should be framed through positive change in our societies, rather than enacting a burden on society. I'm very heartened to hear the determination of the speakers today, and in particular, one of the previous speakers, Marie Neera, was so inspiring as she got up here and spoke about such the stark reality that it will take $5 trillion in health spending, global health spending around the world, if we do not enact our climate policies. And finally, it's a great honour for me to be here alongside the Irish delegation. We may be a very small country, but in recent weeks we have just passed some of the most progressive and some of the most positive and some of the most radical climate action legislation in the world. And we, as a small country on the western edge of Europe, are so prepared and so determined to play our role in this global fight against climate action. And a lot of times it's been said back to us in our Parliament, well, what's the point of Ireland doing this? What's the point of Ireland as a small country introducing all these rules and regulations when you have bigger polluters around the world? Well, we want to be the leading country for small countries in this planet about what we need to do with climate action. And I have no doubt that other countries, particularly in the European Union, over the next couple of years will look towards Ireland, will look towards that climate legislation, that climate action legislation, and hopefully will take a lot of positives from it and introduce it in their own respective democracies. Thank you.
La ringrazio.
Thank you. On my list I have Faisal Javed, member of the Environment Committee of the Senate of Pakistan.
Per favore la mascherina.
Could you please wear your face mask?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Pakistan's case study to success showing great commitment and implementation under the leadership of Prime Minister Imran Khan. Pakistan became the first country in the world to meet the International Bond Challenge, and challenge was to restore around 350,000 hectares of land into forest. Pakistan restored over 600,000 hectares of land into forests, planted over 1 billion trees in KP province, and now we have made a commitment of planting 10 billion trees across Pakistan. And out of 10 billion trees, over 1 billion trees have already been planted. Pakistan's commitment towards climate change fighting climate change is commendable. We achieved United Nations Climate Action Goal, SDG 13, that too a decade before the deadline. So Pakistan has done a lot. Major initiatives that we took was the 10 billion tree project, Clean and Green Pakistan, and also Protected Areas Initiative and electrification of transport. Ecosystem Restoration Fund has also been launched in Pakistan. What Pakistan has achieved, despite resource constraints, is aspirational for many countries. Pakistan contributes less than 1% of the global greenhouse emissions, but yet we are constantly among top 10 most impacted countries by climate change. Pakistan shows the way on climate change as the World Bank new engagements in Pakistan in financial year 2021 hit the highest climate co-benefits in the world in terms of absolute value, and highest in South Asia as a percentage of new commitments. Developing countries, of course, need a lot of support from the developed countries, and we do hope as we walk in COP26, we go with great negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask whether the main speakers wish to take the floor again. Please, Minister.
for this opportunity. I'll take just 30 seconds, and I think it was clear that there is a general consensus about what we have to do, but of course there are totally different local circumstances, and this appeared very clear after the different contributions. So some of the countries were pointing out about the impact of COVID, about the impact of extreme weather events connected to the climate change. Others were talking about energy poverty. Others were talking about nutrition and food. So clearly the agenda is very complicated. It's a multidimensional problem. We know it. There's no single solution. And if this were easy, we would have done it already. So we are perfectly aware of the fact that we have to work hard. But I should take the good part. The good part is that everybody agrees about the fact there is urgency, and we're all moving in the same direction. Everybody according to its possibilities, the local possibilities and local circumstances. I think this is a very good point for the COP26. We know that this is a global effort, and I see a lot of goodwill to accomplish something in the future.
Here we hope that this spirit of consensus and cooperation and collaboration filters down in Glasgow. I also heard, as the minister indicated, that consensus around the need for an urgent and ambitious response to the climate crisis. All of you stressed this. All of you also stressed that the response to the climate crisis must address the ongoing challenges that many of you face as it relates to responding to the COVID-19 crisis. I also heard emerging consensus around the need for balanced deliverables and outcomes in Glasgow and beyond that keep the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement within reach. That also leads to significantly scaled up climate finance, including delivering on the 100 billion as a floor, but also recognizing, as many of you said, that it will take the trillions of dollars mobilized to address this crisis. And finally, many of the countries that spoke are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And it was inspiring to hear how issues related to adaptation and resilience are being prioritized. My only request to you, with 3 weeks left towards Glasgow, is that you transmit these messages to your national delegations who will be traveling to the climate talks. Many of you spoke about finalizing the rule book at Paris. They're highly technical negotiations, but it needs political will, political impetus from ministers and negotiators to find solutions. So please, we need your voices at home. Really transmit the really inspiring messages around action and urgency and ambition to your national delegations as they head towards Glasgow. It's been a pleasure participating in this event, and thank you so much for inviting me.
I wish to thank all those who've taken the floor. This brings the second session of our proceedings to an end. Many thanks. And now, however, we move on to the our witnesses. As you know, recently in Milan, an assembly of youth gathering was held where almost 400 people from all over the world, young people, were presenting their proposals in view of the Glasgow COP. We decided to invite 2 of these young people so that we can hear from them their positions and proposals, which are of great interest to our proceedings. Daniele GUADAGNOLO is now invited to take the floor.
Roberto FICO e anche il Presidente del Senato della Repubblica Italiana, Maria Elisabetta Alberti Casellati, per averci dato l'opportunità di essere qui oggi.
Given us the opportunity to present the results of Youth for Climate and make it possible for the voice of the young to be heard. The absolute priorities which emerged from an encounter of 400 young people from all over the world are summarized very briefly in 4 points. Point 1, zero emissions by 2030, making use of a fair and just transition, also from the point of view of effects on jobs and giving priority to energy efficiency and more renewables and to solutions based on nature. As a part of this point, there's also the request for policies of adaptation and resilience, not just for climate change, but also for sustainability. Point 2 concerns introducing into the school curricula a course on environment and climate change so that children and young people do not need to search information, getting sometimes misleading results. Point 3 concerns the involvement of young people inside decision-making processes at the multilateral, national and local level. And this obviously with the support of member states for young people in order to optimize action against climate change. Point 4 means ensuring that energy transition is inclusive and diversified, or that it takes into account non-institutional actors and minorities. This is something which has been stressed as being particularly urgent, and the creation of financial flows which are more transparent and usable so that they can support the action to reduce emissions and also include the most vulnerable communities.
Grazie. Invito
Thank you. I'd like to call on Federica GASBARRO. I'd also wish to thank Roberto FICO, President of the Chamber of Deputies and the President of the Italian Senate, Maria Elisabetta Alberti Casellati, and all those present. The experience of Milan not only made us feel a part of the process, but gave us the possibility of meeting each other and looking into the eyes of people who are directly feeling the devastating effects of climate change. In those gazes, and particularly the gaze of a boy called Max, there were 13 million people reflected who face food insecurity in Madagascar. Many of these face a drought. Valerie's eyes, instead, showed us the faces of the 80% of the population in Peru which does not have access to electricity. And I could continue with many other similar cases. When we speak of climate crisis and zero emissions by 2030, either we're called catastrophists or we're looked at as if we are naive. But according to science, those people who we feel to be so far away today will be us, will be our children. So do we really want to tell them that we just stood by looking on? We need to begin to see ourselves as something which is united with nature, not something which is separate from it, because until then we will continue to ravage it. Speaking with a scientist at the IPCC, they said it's clear that the 1.5 degrees will be passed, but he also confirmed another idea of mine, that altogether, if we are concrete, use science and be responsible, we can still do something and we can write a new final chapter. It depends only on us, the people in this room and the people outside this room. I'd like to leave you with a particularly beautiful quotation I've heard in the meeting Youth for Climate, which is, we'll go back home, crossing the paths of life, meeting the faces of a needful humankind, needful of love. We will tread the soil which wants to be respected and not exploited, loved and not raped. We'll look at the sky with the sun shining beyond the clouds to rekindle hope. And we will look at the scars which are in the dark and which we can see. Thank you.
Grazie mille.
Many thanks for your statement. So with this, we bring the proceedings of our meeting today to an end. Many thanks to all of you.